ora everyone. My name's Sophie Zepicki. I'm the editor of Assemble Papers, which is a magazine you may have heard of. It's distributed for free around Melbourne and it covers many topics from housing, urbanism, arts and social infrastructure. It's published by Assemble, which is a housing company dedicated to building more sustainable and financially accessible housing for Victorians. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion, Let the Citizens Shape the City from Bounce Back to a New Normal. We would like to acknowledge that we are hosting this event from the lands of the Burrnong and Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation. We also acknowledge that the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all watch today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the land and waters of Victoria and across Australia. Indigenous sovereignty has never been ceded. So over the last year, various types of health and cultural pandemics have brought to light gaps or perhaps cracks in our social, political and economic systems. These gaps, while problematic, could also be somewhat advantageous. We have the opportunity now with the right government policy and investment to recover from COVID-19's lockdowns in a way that makes our cities greener, more equitable and also inclusive. But I guess the question is, how do we as developers, architects, designers and city planners, and in this time of unexpected quick stimulus, make sure that a diversity of citizens' voices are heard in shaping the future of our city? So Assemble Papers is examining the effects of community engagement from past to future in the next issue, tentatively entitled Mind the Gap, which will be published next year in January. And the panel discussion tonight is sort of a part of that ongoing investigation, and it's instigated by MGS architects, who are well known for multi-scaled thinking in their approach to architecture and urbanism. And it's my pleasure to introduce the host of this session, Catherine Sunderman, Associate Director at The Practice. Catherine is, sorry. Yeah, okay. So Catherine is leading master plan projects for universities, creative employment areas and housing precincts. And she draws on her experience working as an architect and urban designer in Australia, Germany and the Netherlands, and is very passionate about promoting a better way of delivering new neighbourhoods in Australia to help create more diverse and inclusive cities. So welcome, Catherine, and all the panellists. And I think I'll hand it over to you to start the discussion and do some introductions.
Thanks so much, Sophie, and thanks to M4Viewing and Assemble Papers for your support in really enabling this conversation tonight. So tonight we'll be discussing how and why everyday citizens can have a much greater role in the decisions of shaping our neighbourhoods and cities. So I'm meeting you today from the lands of the Burrnong and Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation. We had NAIDOC Week last week with the theme Always Was, Always Will Be, recognising that First Nations people have occupied and cared for this continent for over 65,000 years. So as tonight's conversation is about ensuring a diversity of voices are heard in how planning and development occurs, with every project it's important to know that we start with the voices of traditional owners. So while this isn't the explicit focus of tonight's conversation, I think it's worth mentioning that MTalks has this incredible series run by Black Architecture, and they're going to have a panel discussion on the 1st of February looking specifically at co-design and collaboration in the context of Indigenous built environment projects. So that's one worth checking out. It's also worth mentioning that tonight we're meeting virtually on the site of the 2015 Amanda Levette Pavilion in Docklands. And so I think for me personally, the idea of M-Pavilion is really a really important opportunity for us to gather and kind of, have a drink, but kind of share ideas, converse, and participate in something called cultural citizenship. So I think Tanya will maybe speak a bit about that later. But I think institutions like this play that important role in a kind of soft touch way in terms of how we can be more engaged. And so firstly, let's start, why are we having this conversation tonight? I think most people could be forgiven for thinking that community engagement in planning and development is really something kind of nice to have for members of the community that might have a little too much time on their hands. And I think also a lot of us have seen urban development happening around us and thought, you know, change is going to happen, it's inevitable, and, you know, how would I even have a say in how it's going to happen? You know, if I do engage, will it even matter? Is it a waste of my time? However, given the complexities and the urgency of the climate change crisis that we're facing alongside COVID-19, it's essential that community voices are heard. And so without your input, the agenda will be dominated by vested interests of a few and of politicians far removed from the realities of daily life. So, you know, great, let's be involved, but what would that look like beyond the standard kind of tick box community engagement sessions? So each of our panellists tonight, and we've got 4 panellists, represent at least one way you can be actively involved in these processes, whether it's through participating in existing community engagement process, being involved in deliberative practices, which we'll go through a bit in a second, and such as citizen juries, advocating for change, or investing directly in projects that would change the city. So now I'm going to introduce each of the panellists, and it'd be great as I introduce you if you could acknowledge what country you're joining us from. So firstly, we've got Bridget Salmon. She's a senior policy advisor for the Victorian government and recently co-founded Australian Planners Declare, which is a climate and biodiversity crisis declaration network for Australian urban planners to help advocate for and shape planning policy and regulation. She will speak to you about this idea of participating in community engagement processes. How can you make the most of your involvement and how these processes can be improved?
Hi, Kath. Thanks so much for having me. I'm coming from Wurundjeri country today, and I'm very excited to be here and engage in the conversation.
Thanks, Bridget. Next up, we've got Anna Calderma. So she's an experienced statutory and strategic planner with a vision to improve the social experience of future generations through planning and design. Sounds excellent. She founded Shape Urban in 2015 over in WA with a focus on community-led planning and visioning through deliberative engagement. She will speak to this idea of deliberative practices such as citizen juries. Thanks, Anna.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm zooming in from Whadjuk country in the Noongar Nation, so the southwest of Western Australia.
Thanks, Anna. Next up, we've got Tanya Davidge. So she's an architect, advocate, writer and researcher, and co-founder of the architectural research practice UPLA. As the president of the public space advisory group Citizens for Melbourne, Tanya led the successful Our City, Our Square campaign, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, which was about opposing the demolition of Federation Square's Yarra building and its replacement with an Apple store. So she will speak to you about the idea of advocating for the change that you want to see, whether it's writing to your MP or dancing around Fed Square in an Apple costume. So I'm sure she can enlighten us on that later. Thanks, Tanya.
Hi, lovely to be here. I'm zooming in from the lands of the Yalukit Willem clan of the Kulin Nation down here in Elwood, and I'm looking forward to the chat this evening.
Thanks, Tanya. So finally, we have Ross Harding. Ross is an optimistic and creative engineer who provides strategic advice on projects relating from houses through to citywide master plans through his consultancy Finding Infinity. Ross is also a founder of the Off the Grid Festival, a cultural intervention dedicated to transforming cities. Ross and his team are currently collaborating with 15 architecture firms to help transform Greater Melbourne into the world's most self-sufficient city as part of a project called A New Normal, which he'll take us through today. So he will speak about the idea of investing directly in projects that help shape the city. Thanks, Ross.
Hi, everyone. I'm calling in from the Wurundjeri and Bumurong country. It's Fed Square. I'm actually at Yost's place at the moment. Hi.
Perfect. Thanks. Great. So the format of the discussion is really simple audio, followed by a facilitated discussion, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. So we've tried to make this as participatory as possible, as in this kind of awkward Zoom format. But please feel free to add any questions that you have as the conversation continues, and we'll try and answer as many as we can when we get to the end. So you saw that poll at the start. Let's start by seeing what that uncovered. If Molly, you could bring up the polls. So our first question was, in the last 2 years, have you taken part in any sort of community engagement for local and state government? And even in this very passionate group that we have joining us tonight, only 38% have in the last 2 years. So that's pretty high. But yeah, interesting to see that 15% of people have done that many times in the year, which is excellent. And so what would make you be more interested and able to participate in these sessions? So we had a variety of options, and it seems quite clear that actually knowing it was taking place is the most important element. So I think for those working in community engagement, how can we get the message out there, and perhaps using some more unconventional formats? I know that, yeah, whether it's social media or kind of posters up on the wall or something like that, I think it's obviously a big gap that we have. So we've got 2 more polls, if you could bring them up, Molly. So I guess these really relate to what are the things that you would like to see in your neighbourhood, given that we're at this time of potential change with the kind of coming out of COVID-19, what would you like to see differently in your neighbourhood? And then also, how will you support this aim in the next year? Woohoo! Okay, so we've got a whole range of answers, but I think that the number one coming through is moving towards carbon neutrality. So that's definitely, I guess, you know, the apex of the most fundamental issues that we're facing today. So that's really incredible that we're seeing that. But coming close second is really looking at more affordable housing. So it's super exciting that we've had that announcement just yesterday for, what was it, $5.3 billion worth of investment in social housing and affordable housing in Victoria, which is very exciting. And so how would you like to support this aim? Interestingly, most people will aim to participate in community engagement that already exists for local government. But yeah, it would be interesting perhaps if we were to take this again at the end of today, which I don't think we will, but whether some of the other options become a little bit more, you know, but perhaps there's a bit more agency there, but that's something that we can unpick a bit more and perhaps for the panellists to reflect on as well. Great. Okay, so after the introductions and the polls, let's get started on the actual discussion. So we're going to obviously ask all the panellists to contribute, but I would ask each of you to keep your answers as succinct as possible, just so that we can continue the conversation and cover as many of these questions as we can get through. So I think that the first question that I wanted to ask, and I might direct this at Bridget, is why is it important that citizens' voices are represented in the planning and design of our cities? What are your thoughts on that, Bridget?
Great question. Well, if you think about what our cities are, without people, without nature, without environment, they're nothing. And so if we don't engage with the very essence of what creates a city and a space, then how are so-called built environment experts supposed to understand what people's needs are, how to address issues of equity and justice? And if we don't engage, we're not listening, and we can't understand issues that need to be addressed, but not only responding to issues, but understanding people's lived experiences and looking to the ways in which we can move forward and change and grow as we need to.
Tanya, did you have any more thoughts to add on that? I think you're muted.
As usual, that's the catch cry of 2020. It's going to be on t-shirts everywhere. I think I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be a citizen, and so I suppose coming from the other perspective, I think we build our cities together, essentially, and you know, they are made for people, as Bridget said, but we should be building them together. It's part of, you know, citizenship is collective. It's coming to kind of collective consensus. This is what living in a democracy is about. And so in some ways, I think, although it's often hard to work out how to do it, we almost have an obligation to participate. We have rights as citizens, and as individuals, we have individual rights as well, but there's something that's wonderful about kind of participating collectively, and I would urge everybody to think about how they can do it more often.
Definitely. Ross, did you have any thoughts on that? Why is it important?
Why is it important for citizens to engage? I think you mentioned in the intro, really. I mean, basically, otherwise people that we don't want to be in control of our city are in control of our city. It's like, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think that the more participatory the people are, the closer the city is to the way, fairer and more sort of, yeah, I mean, it's a city for everyone rather than just a few.
That's right. And Anna, to conclude, I know that you are both a planner and a facilitator of deliberative processes. From your professional perspective, why is it important to get those citizen voices in there?
The comment about cities being or places being for people is quite clear, but I think there's also something really nice about citizens being involved in decision making. We kind of constantly hear this idea of mandates at political levels that, I feel like that's just putting icing on a cake for politicians to say they're listening to people. People don't speak directly through that process. They don't speak directly through issues on that process. And we want people to be able to speak directly about issues that affect them right there and then, not some sort of larger policy setting that might only respond to one element of their concern. So it's part of the democratic process to be involved and to be part of the decision making at your level, whichever level that is.
That's right. And I think, as Ross said, what's the risk? Like if you don't participate, then there are these other voices that are making those decisions, which will have an impact on your life as well.
Yeah. Maybe one thought to add to that is just also like, I think that, in some ways the way the city is because of limitations from the past and holding on to those limitations. And it's like, we don't necessarily need to just vote a few people in to make all decisions in this day and age. So there's sort of, as time changes, there's more ability to be more involved, but it's not necessarily representative always.
So in terms of those ways that you can be involved, at the start I kind of framed it in terms of these 4 methods of participate, deliberate, advocate, invest. But I'd really love to hear from each of the panellists in terms of what is one powerful way that citizens can be involved in shaping the city. Bridget, did you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. I have had to think about this. I guess from my perspective, I was just reflecting on what Ross has said, because I think it's really important to acknowledge sort of formal ways that we can be involved in a process, and informal ways. And there's, as Ross just mentioned, a lot of agency now, or depending on who you are, perhaps access to a lot of tools and mechanisms that you can shape a city without actually having to be involved in a formal process that might be government or top-down led, which I think is really exciting, particularly in the sort of climate change, climate action space. But for me, it's about picking your moment. So inform yourself of agendas that might exist at a political level, and pick the right moment to advocate. So you have to be savvy. You have to have a think about those mandates that Anna mentioned, if we're thinking about ways in which we can influence and advocate, and try and be clever in the way in which you might decide to spread your message. So I'm a massive fan of writing a letter to MP. I think, or I guess it would be an email these days, but now working for the government, every single day you hear of, oh, well, we're researching this because someone in the local community wrote to their local member because of the issue X, and now our minister has said that we need to research this. And I wish everybody knew that was something that you experience as a public servant, because every email counts, and the more on a certain issue, the better.
That's great, Bridget, because I think I have written letters to the MP and it just feels like it's like you're sending something into the void, and it just like doesn't really seem like it's, you get the generic response if you're lucky and you're just not sure if it means anything, but you're saying that it actually really does.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that it will always result in the change that you want it to result in, but those letters are getting read, which I think is the really important first step. But again, that ability to pick your moment, I think, is really important in trying to create change.
What do you mean by pick your moment?
I guess when you're thinking about momentum that might be building around a particular issue, and so perhaps that's affordable housing or even COVID as being a moment. So so we're in a time of crisis. We all know that there will be a political need to respond to said crisis. So how is it that there perhaps may have been a movement sort of on the surface that's occurring for a while, and now we have an opportunity to grasp at a particular topic and start really heavily campaigning for a response to that, because we know at a political level there will need to be a response to a certain event that might occur.
Awesome. Anyone else?
I just want to reinforce the right to your MP. I sent countless letters off around Fed Square to many ministers, in fact at one point all ministers in cabinet, and I got countless generic responses back, but then in later meetings I realized that they had been read. So and that was actually quite a wonderful feeling, because you do feel quite frustrated when you get the very nice response, or this is some other minister's place to comment on, or what they oversee. But it was just, people do read them, and it's sometimes surprising and it's sometimes wonderful. So highly recommend it.
That's great, Tanya. Anna, did you have something to, what's your kind of one idea of how we can participate?
I think very much about getting a bit of people power. So the idea of writing to MPs is great. I think what happens quite often in stakeholder engagement circles is we do stakeholder mapping, and there's two standard things that we would look at when we're doing stakeholder mapping, and it's influence and interest. And those two avenues often miss out on the people, so the people behind me, just the average everyday, the ordinary human. They either don't individually represent enough influence or don't individually express enough interest to hit those markers. And so they can get missed. And what we need to do is try and get a coalition of those people together. So a coalition of 10 people sends a letter to an MP about the same topic. They become noisier. And the larger the coalition, the noisier they become. And that starts to build momentum. And then all of a sudden they become really powerful, really influential, really interested. And then they hit the mapping, then they hit the stakeholder mapping threshold.
That's interesting. So it's about forming these coalitions. And I guess that makes it easier as well in terms of, because you won't keep it for very long if it's just you by yourself with trying to push a certain agenda. But if you have a kind of network of people, that might make it a bit, if you've got that kind of peer support to keep going. And Ross, did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I know I'm kind of down for investing, right? But I think that I might sidetrack that a little bit.
Yeah, go for it.
In the sense that, building on what everyone else is saying, I think that my personal experience was just stop with these imaginary barriers that we all have. I think that we all think that someone else is in charge of something, or we all think that someone else is probably doing that thing that we thought of that we needed to happen in our city or in our neighborhood, or and I think that my personal experience was like, always obsessed with the idea of making, this whole city completely self-sufficient in terms of energy, water, and waste. And as I started to dig deeper, I kind of realized that no one was trying to do something like that. And my biggest barrier was that I couldn't convince someone to pay me to work it out. I wanted to like get the fees to do it. And I think that when I just let go of that as a barrier, I was like, oh, I can just do it anyway. And I think when you kind of, any barrier or excuse that comes up, there's a way of overcoming that. And I think that to me is sort of what everyone is kind of getting at, in the sense that if you can build up enough momentum and you can kind of, create enough noise and you can get enough support for something, anything's possible. And I think that we're often kind of limited by seeing what has been done already. And I think that they're just kind of barriers and excuses. So I feel like if you just eliminate them, then anything's possible.
Well, that's great. And as an example of that, we mentioned this idea of the new normal at the start. Could you take us briefly through what that actually is, and how I might be able to be involved, or how anyone could be involved in that?
Yeah. Well, I'll try and do it quickly because go on for a lot about it. But long story short, we looked at 2030 and said, how do we get to zero carbon, water neutral, zero waste as a city? How much would it cost, and what things do we have to do to make that happen, assuming that you're only using currently available technology? So we kind of ran all the numbers. It took us about 2 years. And then we basically worked out an answer, and then we realized that no one would really get it. So we sort of just translated it into 15 projects across the city with 15 different architecture firms. And actually, I think people are really starting to engage with it. We haven't released it yet, but the kind of response behind the scenes has been really lovely. And so our approach is to try and unlock this $100 billion transformation that we feel that the state government's not just going to proactively do. We feel like we can just work with the private sector to sort of accelerate that and de-risk it for the public sector. And I guess a huge part of the process has been combining technology and culture. We're talking about it as integrating the physical infrastructure that makes the city work with the cultural infrastructure that enables us all to thrive. That was a long sentence. And basically, I guess there's two parts to that from a community engagement perspective. Is that one is that I've been spending a lot of time having no idea what I'm doing, just asking questions, and finding that really, from a sort of crowdfunding perspective and an individual perspective, there's probably the highest risk investors would be in that space. So the further down the chain you go in terms of risk, I guess you've got people who are prepared to take bigger risks with smaller funds. But actually, we, looking at it internationally, probably 99% of those funds are going to come from the private sector. So it's sort of potentially a step to get it started. But I think equally, it's sort of interesting to look at it as a starting point, not as a solution.
Yeah.
So there are 15 propositions, and particularly the community engagement aspect we're interested in is to be proactive about that, but then to gain feedback as we go.
So these 15 propositions, which haven't launched yet, are kind of listed on a website, and you've worked with 15 architects to make these great little visualizations of them. When you say the investment from the private sector, can that be literally crowdfunding? Can it be like your mum putting a couple of $100 in it, or is it much more significant than that? Yeah.
So the thing is, kind of like a derivative of Richard Florida's, like, why buy an apartment when you can buy the whole neighborhood? It's a little bit like, why power your house when you can power the whole neighborhood? And I think that it's interesting because, the whole system is going from a monopoly of, with decentralized energy, basically, with centralized energy, into a system that is about to become completely decentralized. And it could just go from one monopoly to another. there's a huge opportunity to go, well, hang on, you can actually speed that transition up by decentralizing the ownership at the same time.
Yeah.
So definitely, I think, individuals can, there's so much that people can try and accelerate and drive through.
Great. No, that's exciting. Yeah, I'm really interested, as you know, in that idea of, one option is why not just take some money. And I know, for example, Hepburn Wind, you can put $1,000 into that and help support them, and actually as an investment. So, and also community solar and things like that. So there's this idea of, literally putting your money to kind of help support some of these initiatives. And so, yeah, it's literally kind of having that kind of putting your money into making the change that you want to see. So it's a much more kind of direct, and I think it's, not open to everyone, but one kind of option.
Definitely. And I think a big factor in that is that usually the biggest barrier in getting projects like that up is community opposition. So if the community is actually owning it and investing in it, there's a lot more support.
Great point.
Yeah.
And I'm interested, Anna, you were talking about this idea of building a coalition and generally getting a broader range of voices involved. I know that you run something called Deliberative Practices, which you've kind of hinted at a few times, but haven't really gone through what that is. Could you explain what that actually is, and perhaps give an example of what the benefits are of that approach?
Yeah, so a deliberation or deliberative engagement is typically when we're asking a community to actually help us create the recommendations. So quite often we ask people questions like, what do you like about this? Or how does this place feel to you? And they're lovely questions, and they do unveil quite sometimes in-depth answers, but sometimes just quite surface answers, sort of top of mind stuff. And so in deliberative engagement, what we typically do is we provide a much larger space, time particularly, but a much larger space for people to discuss the topic. So where we might do a 2-hour workshop just to unveil some of the sort of top of mind thinking, with the deliberative process, we might do like a half day or a whole day workshop, and we might do 3 or 4 of those with the same group of people. What we're doing is we're essentially saying, you are actually really clever. You're the experts. You have a lot of information. You're really knowledgeable. You've got the lived experience of this space. You know which section of your street looks good, or which part of your neighbourhood feels better than another part. And we say, okay, so we're going to invite you to be part of a conversation. You're going to tell us some things. We're going to tell you some things. It's a bit of a learning framework. And then we're going to start to come up with solutions together. And then once we've got a few ideas, we'll test that amongst the group, and then we'll try it again. And so we do that for a period of time until we come up with recommendations. So it takes a bit of time. I've got a great project over here that will be super relevant to the audience in Melbourne because you have a new local government act that requires this to be done. But we did a project called Imagine Vincent, which is for the city of Vincent. And these good people behind me in this image, they actually helped create the engagement process for that. So we deliberated from the first moment of that project. And then we did some much more traditional engagement. We asked people lots of questions. And then we had a panel brought together at the end who came up with their recommendation about how the city should move forward. So they truly did take all of the information available. They listened to all of the feedback from the rest of the community, which is 1,000 odd people. And then they weighed up the information that they had, and they basically made recommendations. They set a vision, and their vision, paraphrased was, we belong to a council that says yes. And so it was very proactive. The council has been saying yes. So the council actually felt that the amount of detailed consideration that had gone into that process was well and truly adequate enough for them to make decisions. Just in one aspect, which was sustainable transport, which the community was so behind. They've since made, targeting a 40k speed limit throughout the whole local government area, expanded bike paths. They're trialling electric scooters as soon as they can get the tick from the Road Traffic Safety Office. So they're not afraid anymore to make decisions that follow that one particular path and many other paths that were sort of discussed through the process.
Right.
And that's what gives people, so now there's so many people that feel like they've got power to help make that decision. They were given the time and the faith to be able to make those decisions without an agency telling them.
It's great. And do you think, because often I find in kind of local and state government, there's the elected officials that are almost second guessing what the community thinks, and they might have quite a conservative approach. It might be like, yes, everyone needs their car park in front of the shops. Do you think that you get surprised by what the community comes up with, that it might be a bit different to what was expected, or
Yeah, for sure. The thing, and this is what I find in all of our deliberative processes, the community who are not supposed to be experts, who are not supposed to know everything there is to know about planning, when you give them the same information that we have as professionals, they know a ton more about planning. They know a ton more about how it feels and how it impacts them. And they just make really good decisions. And then the council can say, okay, maybe this is a good decision. Maybe we can follow this path and feel comfortable doing so. And it works. Every time I've seen it so far, it works really, really well at bringing people on a journey, and then they just take off and they just start doing it for themselves.
That's great. That's great. So if I wanted to be part of one of these processes, how could I be involved? And I guess also, how do you make sure the whole thing isn't loaded with some very vocal kind of 60 pluses? How do you get the diversity?
Well, we randomly select and stratify samples, which is a pretty big effort. Most of the time, if we want a panel of 40 or 50 people, we've got to invite about 10,000.
Wow.
But we also pay them, not a huge amount, but we pay them to be experts. So we pay them to come on board. To get involved, you would obviously, because it's random, you'd have to respond to the random invitation and then be randomly selected. But I think you will see, particularly in Victoria, more of that happening in the coming months and years as the new Local Government Act starts to sort of make that more embedded. It's happening more and more over here. And I think Imagine Vincent was probably the third one that had happened in WA. So, it's pretty fresh. It's been done around the world for years, but we're just catching up here.
That's great. That's really exciting. So something we'll be seeing a bit more of, hopefully.
I think so, yeah. And keep an eye out. It's like everyone who does it comes out the other end feeling so much more empowered. So get involved. If you see
That's awesome. That's great.
Oh, sorry. There's actually one going on in Moreland. So if any of the not this specifically the same process, but if anyone is interested, the Centre for Democracy is hosting a very similar thing. You have to make a commitment. You do have to self-nominate, but you will be paid for your expertise. So if anyone in Victoria here in the audience is interested, look up the City of Moreland. I'll find a link and send it in.
That's awesome. Thanks, Bridget. And do you have any thoughts on, we do have these standard kind of processes that you can be part of, that there's an apartment building being built down the street and I can write in an objection, or there's the whole Participate Melbourne thing where I can be part of a strategy. Is that worth my time to be responding in those ways, and how can I make sure that what I say is actually useful?
Well, as an advocate for active, yes, I would say yes, it's definitely worth your time. But I do think that there are, as I sort of alluded to before, depending on the nature of the engagement that you're partaking in. So if it's a process, and so you talk about the apartment building going up next door, often that's because of the nature of the Victorian planning system and the way that it works, it's a highly adversarial form of engagement. And it's not really engagement. It's essentially asking for you to either object or not comment on an application. And so I think in that instance, if you were wanting to participate in that process, I would be thinking about what your motivations are behind that, talking to somebody to understand your rights, but also your obligations as a neighbour as well, and really think about what it is that you would like to achieve through engaging with that process, because it's very different to the more traditional, like the process that Anna was talking about there, in which case it may leave you feeling less satisfied if you do not get what you want, because it's very much about sort of neighbourly relations. But I still think there is a system in place that enables you to engage in that process. And if you do feel as though you're being unfairly impacted upon, I would always encourage someone to engage. And
is it right that this, because this idea that I can object to my neighbour's property, you can't do that in New South Wales, is that correct?
There are avenues by which you can object to an application, but it's not the same. Like, so Victoria has the largest extent of what we call third-party appeal rights. So essentially your right to take your neighbour or person in your street to a tribunal. We have the most extensive of those rights. In New South Wales, those rights do exist, but they're much more limited, which can be both a positive and a negative thing. I would argue that in New South Wales, it's not a positive thing because their rights are reduced. They've designed their system so that the rights of you when you purchase your land and the development rights attributed to your land being purchased are more known. And so you're unlikely to get a shock as to what your neighbour is putting up. So the system itself is better. It's not that the rights have been reduced. So I think it's about the system and the way in which the planning system has been designed to enable people to have a voice.
Yeah, interesting. And can I, rather than objecting, can I support something being put forward?
Yeah, you definitely can. And more recently, people have definitely been engaging in that sort of activity. So when you receive your letter from your local council about your neighbour building a building next door to you, more often than not, it will ask you whether you would like to object. It may not explicitly state whether you would like to support the application or not, but I would always encourage you, if you think that this is something really positive that's happening within your street, I would encourage you to write a letter of support, because silence isn't considered support, and that's a really important aspect of the process. And so often council planners, councillors, they're inundated with negative responses to a development, and it's really hard for them to gauge how the community actually feels about a development if they're not able to have an understanding of what support might exist. Absolutely, yeah.
Definitely. And Tanya, I know that we mentioned that you were part of the whole Fed Square, trying to get rid of Apple campaign. What were some of the tactics that you used for that? Like, we've spoken about writing to your MP, but what can you do to advocate for something like that beyond that? And also what has the greatest impact?
Well, I think what has the greatest impact? Maybe we'll get to that at the end. Firstly, I'd say don't despair. I mean, the Apple Store proposal was really interesting in that the planning minister invoked his authority, which meant that the public had no right of comment in the planning process. So we didn't even have the right to object, essentially. And I think primarily for me, that was the biggest issue. That was my biggest concern, is that this is our public space, this is our town square, and yet there was no public voices in that space. So I think there's a lot of things you can do, and I think these kind of processes are really important to engage in, because otherwise we just feel despair. And we know that pre-COVID engagement and trust of our political class was basically at its lowest ebb. There's research that states that, we're not particularly happy with our politicians. I think we're a bit happier with science and our politicians at the moment, which is nice. It'll be interesting to see whether that remains. But deliberative processes and citizen participation, or any kind of participative process really, I think really helps to build trust. And you need trust between governments and communities to actually get things done and to make positive change. If we don't have that trust, then people don't participate. I thought it was really interesting when Anna said that you have to go through 10,000 people to get 40 to 50 panel members. I'm really curious to know whether that's just an Australian thing or everywhere around the world. That's quite worrying to me. But anyway, back to what you can do. I think individually you can do really small things, which are great. You can sign petitions, you can make comments on petitions. I personally read 3,800 petition comments on the petitions we own for Fed Square so that I could make a submission on social significance to the Heritage Council. So they're useful because other people pick them up and use them. You can post comments on social media, you can repost other people's comments, you can write letters to the editor. I might retire and become that lady who writes letters to the editor and like ranty letters to council because it's kind of fun. As mentioned, you can engage in kind of council processes and stuff like that. And these are all things that kind of make you feel like you can act, which is great because it staves off despair. And once you've done them, I think that the next step is to kind of amplify the voices around you. So once you've done that, you've found the like-minded people, hopefully, that surround your issue. And the idea is to kind of meet them, chat with them, talk about things you can do together. The architect and historian Rowan Story brought us all together. So the Citizens for Melbourne were formed from people who'd written something or owned a petition or, had done something around the Fed Square thing. And he brought us together, which was fantastic. And once we became an association, then we could build an audience. We could speak at different places. I think Emma was in the audience. She invited us to speak at the Fed Square debate, which was held, the Apple at Fed Square debate, which was held in the, it's not the Deacon Edge Theatre anymore, is it? Or is it? In the theatre at Fed Square. I'm just going to say that because I can't remember the actual title. And then what that allowed us to do was it allowed us to amplify content and amplify individual people's voices. So and then we could do bigger things. So we held a rally, we facilitated a flash mob where I was not dressed in an apple costume. However, I did run around Fed Square chasing people dressed up as fruit, shouting juice the apple, juice the apple, and then we all lay down and died. It was interesting, but it made the Channel 7 news in Victoria and South Australia. Must have been a slow news night in South Australia. And then we were able to speak in the media. And then we were able to kind of be vocal during the election campaign and things like that. So we kind of built that voice really slowly. I think you have to be prepared to understand that you're acting collectively, and that's actually that it takes time, but that when you do that, it's really wonderful because you're amplifying other people's voices. And then the other thing, I suppose, the last thing that you find is that then you can find your allies within that group of people. So we met, through that, I met the wonderful folk at the National Trust who were advocating for the heritage listing for Fed Square. I met a whole pile of retired historians who are quite amazing in their own right, and I think they keep the heritage process going. I met people at the City of Melbourne, I met councillors at the City of Melbourne, I met politicians who were all kind of interested in, the same outcome. We were all interested in the same outcome. And I had people write to me saying, all I did was I wrote to my MP, I'm really sorry I couldn't do any more. And I valued every single one of those emails because I knew that every single one of those emails amplified that public voice. And I think in the end, that was our aim. So I think we found common ground, and we're lucky in lots of ways that the outcome was really successful, but we know that people in government listened, and we actually went through a community stakeholder process with government, and which was actually really run quite well. But I think if they'd also thinking about a larger deliberative process would have been a really wonderful
definitely
thing to do as well.
And yeah, and I guess for those who haven't followed your story, ultimately you won.
Yes, we did. We were successful, and Fed Square has funding, and they're pretty much looking at kind of everything we asked. But it's not really, I suppose, about what we asked for. We asked for certain things because we knew that Fed Square, through the course of our kind of history and our research with Fed Square, that we knew that Fed Square needed certain things. So they're looking at reviewing the charter. They're looking at, I think they've I think there was $20 million given to Fed Square from the COVID Building Fund to kind of look at a lot of basically just repairs and maintenance that they need to do. They're looking at kind of the ways to engage community in programming at Fed Square more and things like that. So
that's perfect. Yeah, it's fascinating listening to you. I think I have kind of two questions. I'm just going to throw both out there and see who responds. But firstly, I mean, that it's just so incredible that you had that outcome, because I think it wasn't certain. You know, it definitely was something that required that citizen input, or else it would have just happened. But how on earth do you find time to do all of that? And how would you recommend citizens, you know, how can you make time for these processes?
So I wouldn't that's why I definitely would not recommend taking it on by yourself, firstly. I mean, I was lucky I was writing a PhD, and I put my PhD on hold because it became a lot more work than I thought it was going to be, and I'd kind of committed to it, so I followed through. But I had the luxury of being able to follow through, and it does form the last case study in my PhD, so it's nice to have to go out with a bang at the end. So it kind of wasn't quite putting it on hold. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that level of activism for everybody, but I think the key to it is finding that collective voice, finding those allies so that you can amplify. And then I think Bridget was saying before, be strategic. So, you know, there were certain things that we could feed off, like when the City of Melbourne was putting up a submission around Fed Square, we would make a submission to the City of Melbourne. And those kind of things, you can kind of start to work in between the cracks and try to lever things open.
Definitely. Bridget?
I was just going to say, I think also as professionals in the built environment, and particularly leaning on what Anna was saying before, we also need to advocate for the right resources to be put into place to enable these sorts of things to happen, because people are really busy, they're stressed, there's a lot going on. And I know Ross was talking about before barriers, and I was thinking, like, yes, it is true that often barriers, you know, may not be as real as we perceive them to be, but for some people those barriers are really real, and the systems aren't in place to support them, to enable them to be the experts that we need to listen to. And I think we as built environment professionals really need to advocate for the right amount of resourcing and funding to go in to make sure that these processes are done well, because there's nothing worse than a tick the box engagement process. And it means that we can hear from the sort of most diverse range of voices that we need to hear from as well.
I have a question perhaps for you and maybe Anna and anyone else who wants to chime in, but are Australians, you know, do we typically engage more or less than other countries? Who does it well? You know, where do we sit on that continuum?
I think when you look at engagement, the countries that seem to be more engaged are the ones that have sort of grown off the back of a really strong democratic, our voices can be heard, sort of we can rally in the streets. Definitely not countries whose history is sort of basically penalising everyone on the ground until they're into submission. So that's probably not helpful for us. But at the same time, I think some of that sort of willingness to rally in the streets can also go the other way, as we might be seeing globally at the moment. So there's a bit of a fine balance. I think we are definitely a little bit less connected than other cultures. But I think we can change that pretty quickly. I think people generally around the globe are feeling that. They're feeling the disconnectedness. And, you know, speaking of the new normal, I think this is a really good time to pick those people up off the ground and say, don't feel alone. Don't be on your own. Come on board and get involved. And we do have a really beautiful opportunity at the moment. People are more online than they've ever been before. They are more capable of doing these things in different ways than they ever have been before. I think we can capture a much larger population of people now than we've ever been able to. And if that's the only thing good that came out of it, I'm okay with that.
No, that's awesome. I guess maybe while we're here, I'd love to almost open up to questions from the audience. So if you could please, I know I've got some in there, but if others have some questions, that would be really welcome. But I guess to the whole panel, what is it about, right now we're at what I think is one of the most pivotal moments of our lifetimes where we can actually have a real, it's almost like a turning point coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic where we could start to do things differently. How important is the community and citizens taking a greater role in that?
I guess from my perspective, something that I would really like to see and something that I think is sort of entered mainstream media a little bit more is the idea of valuing certain professions and the service that they give to the community, and so and making sure that I'm talking about essential workers, that the value that they give to particularly the way that our cities function, the lessons that we've learned about that contribution to a city aren't lost. And I think it's the responsibility of perhaps non-essential workers to remind decision makers, to remind advocates that these people are doing really worthwhile work that needs to be rewarded both financially and in sort of broader recognition within the community. And I think I'd really like to see a change in the way that we value certain jobs and employment, and that COVID offers an opportunity to do that, but that we don't quickly forget and go back to the way it was beforehand.
Definitely. I wonder, I'm really interested in how, obviously great, participate, but you can't participate in everything. So how can we, how do you actually ascertain what's the most important thing that you want to contribute in your lifetime, and how you can actually, because we don't have time to do everything. Okay, so we've just got a question here from Andy Fergus. So it starts with a key lesson here is that you first have to invest people with information before you can hope to have an effective panel make discussions. What's the role in professionals to assist in the upskilling of the community and building their capacity to be effective participants in these processes? It looks like Anna's ready to answer.
I do have one, and I think this is particularly pertinent to the design industry, and certainly something that I've discovered is when we stop assuming we're experts and start assuming that people who live in a place or experience a place are actually as qualified to make decisions about that as we are, that's a really big deal. We too often, as design professionals, talk to people as if they can't possibly understand the intricacies of the column width and the weight loadings. Fine, maybe they can't understand the structural engineering detail of the building. That doesn't mean they don't understand the inherent needs of that building in that space. Same for a street, same for a public space. I think we need to stop telling them that we know better than them. That would be my recommendation, and that's how I do.
I have a slightly different perspective on the topic. I agree with you from a design perspective, but from a sustainability perspective, I think it's interesting how when you look at 5 million people in Melbourne, there's probably 10 people you can sit in a room to sort of just come together and agree on what the technical solution is. But it almost feels like all 5 million people need to have a PhD in sustainability to solve the problem together, because there's not enough leadership. And I think that kind of my answer to Andy's question is sort of look at gas, for example. If you ask the general public, whether it's good to have natural gas in your building or not, a lot of people are not informed enough to know that it's, that natural gas still is marketed like it's a better thing than, coal-fired power. And so there's certain things that I find like we work on apartment buildings all the time, and it's kind of like you can ask people what they want. They want to cook on gas. You know what I mean? But actually there's certain things that you need to show people that they want. And I think there's that balance. And I think that's where it kind of relates to Annie's question, is that there's certain things that there needs to be some information to help people make the right decision at times. Would you agree with that or not really?
I think probably the thing that I would comment on is never ask people what they want. That sounds really counterproductive. But if I ask you what you want right now, a beer, a wine, sleep, whatever it is, they're all just things that we want. Like wanting is, I mean, I keep trying to tell my children, it's not what you want, it's what you need. So my response to that would be, if we ask people what they want, they'll just tell us what they already know, because that's what people do. We have to frame the question better for them. So rather than asking them what they want, we sort of need to talk to them about the trade-offs of what they're getting. So this is the thing that you're talking about right now that you think you want. These are the trade-offs of wanting that thing. What if you got that same outcome with a different product? And then when you ask them about the trade-offs they're willing to make for what they want, the answer is always different. So I think, yes, you would definitely need people who have expertise in all of those things. But if you give them if you sort of frame up the variations that people are answering the question on, and you ask them in a way that really makes them have to think about it, what they're willing to accept for, then their answers might be different. So that's the way I like to do it in deliberation. You say, not what you want, but if this was the case, then what would your response maybe be?
Yeah, so I think that's a really great way of putting it, Anna. And I think it's interesting with a lot of these really complex challenges that we're facing, having everyone thinking about the technical solutions is not the answer. Like there are, the technical solutions are already there. It's more about kind of getting that collective and political will to actually make the changes.
I think as Australians, we need to be a little bit more comfortable in conflict. I think that maybe we avoid it, like culturally, I think we avoid conflict. And I was in preparation for this talk, listening to a podcast on participatory planning and doing some more reading, and they were talking about that this sort of very rational approach to planning process has always been, we need to build consensus. But no, we're always building consensus. Consensus is not a static thing. And so it's okay that some people might want to go about a thing in a different way. And it's okay that we might have to make a decision that not everybody agrees with. But if the process of getting to that decision isn't fair and equitable and acknowledges and tries to manage different power imbalances, I think that's when it becomes problematic. And I mean, we have an elected democratic system for a reason. We can hold politicians to account by voting them out as well. So that process also exists. But yeah, I think Australians need to be more comfortable in sitting in conflict.
That's a great point.
I'd just like to, I suppose, add a little bit here, but I'm really interested in informal processes of engagement, and that's the kind of cultural civic practices that are interesting. And in some ways, it's actually about, for me, it's about helping people to facilitate participation. Like, how do you welcome people in and invite people in to even just thinking about these processes? And I was thinking about, I think we're running it again at the M Pavilion this year, but me and my colleague Christine Phillips, we run a workshop at the M Pavilion, and we've done it for a couple of years. We didn't do it last year, but it's called Design Your M Pavilion. And we have a whole pile of fun materials. They're not architectural materials. They're kind of materials that children can use to make things and are familiar with. So there's plasticine and pipe cleaners and paddle pop sticks and all this stuff. And we asked them to design a pavilion next to the M Pavilion. And we then Photoshop these pavilions into the site, so that they can see what they would look like if they had designed them. And we find that this actually facilitates the most kind of amazing responses in children and the most incredible conversations. There's conversations about structure and how things hold up, and they work in concert with their parents. And then when they see them they see these images in the site, they see these models photoshopped into the site, they can see that they have made a change in the city, right? That potential to make a change in the city. And when we talk about citizens, we often think about adults, but the idea is that children are children are citizens too, they're just kind of becoming citizens. So how do we kind of start welcoming, and this is why I think deliberative processes are important, but even processes before that, that welcome people into participation and participating in a kind of a civic way. I think they're really, really, really valuable, and we need to see more of them developed and facilitated and rolled out.
Perfect. I do have another audience question, which I think relates to kind of what you're saying. So often engagement is these kind of distinct phases within a project, but does the panel have any ideas of more informal ongoing engagement processes as part of a long-term project? I don't know if any reports on the success of this approach.
I'm a massive advocate. I think what you've got with the new Local Government Act is something of this type, because it's something that you have to keep doing. Our act is similar over here. So we have every 2 years, this sort of same process. So it is a phase, but it's also retesting, which I think is really nice. And if you can convince your local governments to do it really well over there, it will feel a lot more like an ongoing discussion, which is nice. I am running a project over here, which is kind of just an ongoing discussion about my local area. And it's part of the town team movement, which is sort of a localised, community-driven process. And I think there's organisations like that doing it a lot more now. So little local area advocacy groups that are having conversations with their community. So it's sort of out of the realm of local government, out of the realm of government entirely. It's not without its politics, but it doesn't have that same sort of power and control structure over the top of it. And I think some of those processes are worth looking into. I think that's, when I talk about that sort of coalition of people, I think that it's at that level that you can start to build those people that you can call upon if there's something happening locally that's really important. And I think that's kind of a decent example. As far as reports on it, I couldn't point you to one. Sorry.
No, that's great. Thanks, Anna. I think we're coming close to the conclusion, but I'm just wondering if each of the panelists could conclude with a bit of a call to action about a particular project that you know about that you would encourage people to be part of.
I can share ours if you like. We haven't launched it yet though, but you can sign up to a pretty simple website, and we'll be launching in about 2 weeks. It's called, the website is Normalize It, so www.normalizewithant.it, and the Instagram is a new normal Melbourne with underscores in between the words, basically. But, I think we're going to launch early December, late November, something like that.
Sounds great. Looking forward to it.
Following the federal election, my sister and I have started a campaign, if you will, called Take Our Tax. And it's based off the idea that we need tax reform at a federal level in Australia, and we cannot just rely on tax cuts, political wills coming through in every election. We need to think about the sustainable health of our taxation system and what that means for Australia moving forward, particularly from a climate change perspective. So if you are a high income earning individual, you can take our tax pledge and donate your tax cut to any organisation that you think should actually be receiving government funding. But not only that, we don't want the government to then say, well, then we can rely on philanthropy and not need taxes. We want you to sign up to the pledge so that then we can use that movement and go to the federal government and say, see, we don't actually need the tax cuts. We want you to fund the services the government should fund and create a sustainable Australia.
Incredible.
I would say, so I'm not going to promo a project of mine because I'm a long way away from most of you, but I am going to say you can get involved, you should get involved. Your entire state is going through a massive amount of engagement right now. Every single local government is doing it. Yeah, get involved, because the more engaged you are at the moment in that process, the better your local governments will do it next time around and the time after that. So get on board. It's the best time.
Great. And Tanya?
Well, the Citizens for Melbourne, I think we've currently launched a little just social media campaign. We're asking people to photograph public space changes due to COVID in the city, anywhere, Greater Melbourne, actually anywhere, just anywhere, that you see that you like. We'd like to use it as a kind of almost documentary record of what's happening. And how our cities could be better, how cities and towns could be better. So I think the hashtags are Citizens for Melbourne and Our Public Spaces Project. So if you do see something, please take a snap and post it to Instagram for us. You'd be surprised at how useful these things are. Like, they'll be used in future submissions around public space, because we've been making quite a lot of them. And, you know, we don't see everything. So it's great to see other people's, get other people joining in the conversation. So that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Incredible. Well, thanks so much, everyone. And I think, Sophie, you have another event as well that everyone can participate in.
Yeah. I think when we were talking about this panel, we sort of realised at some point that it was somewhat ironic to have a panel about this discussion, and perhaps we needed to do some actual community level engagement. So we will do a workshop next year on the 17th of March, and it will be between Assemble and MGS Architects out at the OMA Pavilion at Monash, with a specific case study. And yeah, there'll be more information around that probably towards the end of the year. But yeah, we hope to engage like really a diversity of people within that specific neighbourhood where the M Pavilion is situated. And yeah, just I guess follow us for updates on also the publication that's coming out, the next issue of Assemble Papers, which is going to touch on a lot of the things that have been talked about in this panel. And thank you so much for your amazing answers.
Perfect. And yeah, thanks so much to all the panelists and to M Pavilion for hosting us tonight. And thanks for everyone's poll responses and their questions. Yeah, it's been a great conversation, so thank you.
Thanks, guys.